Welcome to this final session of the Business Nature Hub from today. We'll have a session now focusing on biodiversity indicators for site-based impacts, measuring corporate biodiversity performance on the ground, which will be focusing on one methodology for measuring biodiversity performance for companies with large site-based impacts. The session will start with a presentation by myself covering, providing a brief background on the methodology itself, the piloting process we went through to refine the methodology, and some insights on the next steps that we have in mind for it. This will be followed by two case studies on the application of the methodology, one by Leo Murphy from Fauna Flora International on the case study from Anglo American, later by Adeline from the Biodiversity Consultancy on the case study from the Total Energies. We'll have a short question and answer session towards the end, and final remarks by Mark Johnston from IPICA. So starting, biodiversity indicators for site-based impacts, or BISI methodology for short. How all started actually? Back in 2016, from the IUCN Congress and also from the CDB, Convention on Biological Diversity, there were recommendations on disclosure and reporting of biodiversity. And this started a move towards more creation of methodologies to measure biodiversity with the process of disclosure. And there was also an interest from companies in measuring their own performance. In response to this demand, several methodologies started to be developed and piloted. We have now a number of methodologies with different purposes, with different applications. So some focus on corporate level, some focus more on the ground level. BISI is one of those methodologies. It was developed on a 3-year process that started back in 2019, jointly by Fauna Flora International, UNEP WCMC, and Conservation International, with support from IPICA, the Proteus Partnership, and the Biodiversity Consultancy. Several companies then volunteered or got together to pilot the methodology, including BHP, Anglo American, Eni, Total, Chevron, Newmont, and Equinor. And this was how we managed to refine the methodology and publish the final version. So what is BISI? BISI is basically a 3-stage approach to measure corporate performance, biodiversity performance. It's a bottom-up approach, so we are focusing on impacts that are happening in site level. And the final stage focuses on aggregating that at corporate level. The methodology starts by a company-wide screening of biodiversity risk, which is done using global data sets. The second stage then looks at the site in particular and data from the site in particular to create indicators for state pressure and response indicators. And the third stage then is looking at aggregation and reporting. As you'll see later, the first 2 stages are the one that we've developed at the most now and refined. The third stage is the one that we'll be looking at developing more in the next steps. So the first stage, biodiversity significance screening. It's a 2-step approach. We first, using global data sets, define the risks for 3 criteria. So by defining the boundaries of the risk assessment, defining the area of influence for each of the sites, we screen those operating sites against features and then score them based on a scoring approach proposed by the methodology, which is here. So basically those are the 3 criterions against which we score each site: threatened species, critical habitats, and protected areas. So for each of those, you have thresholds defined by the methodology in terms of classifying the risk, in terms of low, medium, and high. But we understand that this is still a very high level assessment. So once this is done for the site, the information is then confirmed with the key stakeholders on the site. So if we'll get to them saying, oh, your site was qualified as high because of this information we got from that high-level assessment. Is this relevant in your cortex? Is this equivalent to the information you have on the ground? Basically, it's a quality check. So a quality check following the high-level assessment. And the result of this screening against those three criteria, the scoring and the validation by site managers, is a global screening data dashboard that includes the company sites, the score for each of those three criteria, and the global, so general score, which is the highest score from the three previously. And this is basically a prioritization process right now. We are selecting the sites that will then be prioritized for the application of the methodology on the ground. The second stage is actually the on-the-ground level application of the methodology, where we get the information from each individual site. It could be from the environmental impact assessment, from expert reports, or from even the data that's published for the area. And for each area, we identify focal biodiversity features for indicator development. Focal biodiversity features, as defined by the methodology, would be those relevant features that happen in the area of influence that are affected by the company, and that could also be monitored in long term. For each of those features identified, metrics are selected based on a state pressure and response framework, which for those that don't know, we look at how is the environment right now, what's the kind of pressure that that specific feature is being subjected to, and what's the kind of response the company is already applying to that pressure. This is followed then by scoring of each of the indicators. I will not cover each of the scoring, but the methodology specifies scoring criteria for state, for pressure, and for response. And in the end, what you have is a dashboard that for each of the features identified, so thus all the features that are occurring on the ground that are affected by the company and then that can be monitored, that were selected because of its relevance. For each of those, you classify then state, pressure, and response and create indicators for each of those. It is a sequential approach, so implementation of phase 2 involves identifying what biodiversity is present in the area of influence of the company. So this could be species, habitats, protected areas, identify company-induced pressures on biodiversity, the focal biodiversity feature within the area of influence, identify response linked to the priority features, review monitoring priorities, identify gaps, and then review the metrics against state pressures and response framework. So this is basically when we will score each of the indicators and create a scorecard for the sites. So we had previously at stage 1 a scorecard for all the sites from the company globally. In stage 2 you have a scorecard for the sites, which all the key biodiversity features identified and indicators for each of those 3 elements of the state pressure and response framework. Pilot in BC, as I said, involved 7 countries, 7 companies. We tried to use the piloting to apply the methodology to a diversity of situations. So there are marine sites, there are terrestrial sites, sites in Africa, Australia, Europe, and North America. So also to deal with the different challenges that are faced with such a methodology where you need data. So is the situation you find in Africa the same as the situation you find in Europe? How to deal with the challenges. So we are still in the piloting process here. And this has led to the refinement of the methodology later. It included oil and gas and mining companies, as well as renewable sites. Initially, when BISI started to be developed, it was really focused on the extractive industry. So we started this in collaboration with oil and gas and mining companies. In the process of developing the methodology, it was identified by the team and also by an advisory group that was formed, that it was actually, it could be applied to other sectors and other situations. So that's when a methodology that was extractive focused broadened its scope, but still the piloting happening very much in the extractive sector. It took 2-3 years for us to finalize all the pilots. So it's a process that started in 2019 when we joined together with Fauna Flora International and Conservation International. Each of the partners was responsible for part of the pilots. And this has led to the refinement of the methodology. So the lessons from each of the pilots informed the publication of the final version of the methodology that's available on our website. And this is a new, beautiful designed one. So it was just published a few months ago. It wasn't that nice before. But anyway, this is something we could do with the support from IPICA that has been supported this work for a couple of years. Just some examples, you'll hear more afterwards in the case studies. So just one case, we applied BISI to, in the case of Equinor, which is an oil and gas company. But in this case, we applied it to an offshore wind farm in the UK, the Sheringham Shoal wind farm. This is just to provide some details on the kind of sites that we applied the methodology in, and in the case of the pilots. In the case of Eni, we applied for it on an onshore oil field, which is operational since '96. And the idea here was how to deal with data gaps in the case of older sites. We also applied it to the Anglo-American case that we will hear later, which is in South Africa. It's an open cast iron mine. And there are other cases of oil, gas, and mining as well. Some pre-operational sites. So what would happen applying the methodology before the operation of the company, so that you could inform already the kind of indicators you establish when the company becomes, when the site becomes operational later on. And that's where we are right now. So we've been since 2017, when this whole process started, just after those disclosure and reporting motions from the CDB and IUCN, we've been refining and developing this methodology. Now that it is published and that we decide to move forward with it, so it's one methodology that we believe it's in the forefront of the biodiversity performance methodologies that are out there. It's been piloted with key companies. We are now looking at aggregating and reporting, which is the stage 3. There is already some limited guidance, I assume, on how to aggregate and report. And by that I mean, as it is a site-based methodology, how this information later on gets compiled in a way that it can inform decision at corporate level. And the refining stage 3 is our priority for the next stage. So you'll see that in the guidance there is already some guidance in terms of how this can be done. What we want to do now is actually, with companies moving on to apply the BISI methodology to multiple sites, that we can use this experience to explore the case for aggregation and ultimately reporting, which is something we started to explore already. And a report that was just launched, it's going to be on our website next week. As companies piloting the methodology already received it, we We've explored, so we analyzed more than 100 requirements from different reporting frameworks and identified how the different steps from the biodiversity indicators for site-based impact methodology could inform or support disclosure on each of those requirements. With the aggregation work we intend to do starting next year, this will be further explored. All the things we want to explore now is scaling up BZ application to multiple sites. So in the piloting process, companies applied it to 1 or 2 sites. The idea is now that companies would apply the methodology to multiple sites so that we can start to get data that would be required for the aggregation process later on. And also expanding the application of BZ to other sectors. And the agri picture here is on purpose, so we want to apply BZ on the agri sector. So, and this aligns well with internally at UNEP WCMC with the current expansion of our Proteus partnership, which is currently focused on oil and gas companies, but we'll be incorporating other sectors later on. And we want to have this kind of methodologies also available for them to be applying. That's what I wanted to say. It's just a brief introduction to the methodology. You'll have more information on the document itself, but it's just for introducing the case studies, which is the more interesting part of this presentation, actually. I will pass on to Leo Murphy, which will present the case study from Anglo-America.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So yeah, this is a methodology we've been developing as a partnership with UNEP WCMC, Fauna and Flora International, and Conservation International, as you can see, for quite some time now. This is one of the pilots that we started to conduct to really understand which parts of this methodology worked, which parts didn't, and how we needed to address them in that finally published version of the methodology. So we were working in collaboration with Anglo-American on this pilot. And as Rodrigo just mentioned, we selected the Columella mine in South Africa. It's an open cast iron ore mine. It's been in operation now for about 10 years. And the reason here was actually nothing to do with the site in particular. It was more to do with the fact that we were able to engage with this site. They had the capacity to do that at the time that we wished to take this pilot forwards. It was nothing to do with whether or not the site was thought to be high sensitivity, low sensitivity, or anything like that. It was more of a practical issue around when we wanted to pilot. The site itself didn't have any real assessment of how large an area of influence it might have. And as part of the methodology, what we've stated is when this is lacking, you do a precautionary step, and you expand it out to as far as you can with some of the global data sets, which takes it out to 50 kilometers around the site to look for anything that might occur within those areas, and then start to consider whether or not you may have a potentially negative or positive impact upon some of those features. And as Rodrigo had also mentioned, we piloted stage 1 and 2 of the methodology at this site. As it was only a one-site pilot, there was no ability to sort of aggregate multiple sites together. So we started stage 1, and we used, as we've mentioned, some global data sets. So we reviewed the World Database of Protected Areas and the IUCN Red List, both through IBAT, which is an online platform for data to which Anglo-American and a number of the other piloting companies are subscribers to. And we also used the Global Critical Habitat Screening Layer, which is a layer that has been published by UNEP WCMC, which tries to identify areas around the world that potentially or are likely to qualify as critical habitat, as defined by the International Finance Corporation and their Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity. And we ran this through those data sets, and this provides some preliminary results. But then we went to the site managers themselves with these lists, so a list of the protected areas, a list of the species that we think are present, whether or not we think critical habitat is present, and just tried to validate this with them. Are these things where we think they are? Are the protected area boundaries where the data sets say they are? Are the species we think are present, are they actually there? And on the whole, that validation comes back positively, that these things are where we think they are. The data sets are very reliable for a lot of this. But in this particular case, there was a number of species that were flagged, particularly some of the charismatic mammals, some of the large herbivores, rhino, for example, that were flagged during the global data sets, that actually site managers said, look, we know these aren't present here. The landscape just isn't suitable for them. They are within some fenced enclosures in the area, but they're not present as a wild population. And so we were able to eliminate these kind of species from the data sets when we did the screening. The process itself is actually really quick. Running it through IBAT and running it through the critical habitat screening layer takes an hour perhaps, provided you have a limited sort of GIS capacity. And then the rest of that time, which was only around a day's worth of work, is actually going to the site managers and validating that and running through the lists with them. So here's what we got for the site. We identified that the area of influence overlapped with one protected area. And when we talk about area of influence for this site, we're talking about that 50-kilometer buffer. We identified there was no critical habitat present or likely to be present within the area, but that there were a number of threatened species present. So there were 16 threatened species in total. And what we do actually, just to make sure that we capture the nuances of the critically endangered and endangered species, is we weight those so that critically endangered and endangered species are prioritized higher. So we have a weighted total, and using the methodology's guidance, that also comes out as a medium significant site based on those number of species that are present. So overall, the site's biodiversity significance score for stage 1 was medium, the middle of the three possible options. And were we to have this with a number of other sites, you'd then be able to see where it sat within your portfolio. But obviously, as we only had one, we immediately progressed through to stage 2. So stage 2 is a much more sort of intensive process. What we do is we gather all together the literature from the site, the methodology, all of the global data sets we have. We go through the environmental impact assessment for the site, the biodiversity action plan, and we pull all of this information, all of the data that they've collected, all of the monitoring that's gone on at the site, and we run it through the methodology to try and identify, first of all, what the focal biodiversity features might be, and then what is the state, the pressure, and the response relating to the company on those features. This is a much longer process when you set this up. It took us around 12 days of time to go through some of those documents and put them through the methodology. So you can see this is really where the work actually starts to happen for the methodology. So for this particular site, we identified that there were both habitats and species that were likely to qualify as focal biodiversity features. So these are features that were present within the landscape, likely to be impacted by the company's activities, feasible to monitor, and this is important because we are trying to find indicators. So they must be feasible to monitor, but that doesn't necessarily mean you simply go for the easiest ones. It means that you're not going to rule out, a species where there may be such a low population density that you'd only ever see it once every 5-10 years of monitoring. It's not going to tell you very much on a year-by-year basis about how you're doing in your management of biodiversity. So you need to make sure that it's feasible to monitor it year by year. We identified 6 habitats, which we then grouped together into biodiversity management units to coincide with the way that the site itself was handling them and managing them. And we identified 4 mammal and bird species, or species assemblages, which you'll see on the next slide. So here's what it looks like when you actually get this dashboard and you run all of the information through it. So you can see that, for example, we've grouped a number of these birds together into large ground birds because the impacts that the company will have upon them is very similar. And we identify what are all of the different impacts that we may have at that site. So whether it's collisions with transmission lines, habitat loss and degradation, or illegal harvesting. And through collecting that data and putting it through the methodology's various different thresholds for how much of the percentage of the population locally has been depleted or is predicted to be depleted, we can identify what the state of that biodiversity is. So you can see that for the majority, they're either good or medium or moderate in state, but actually this area of biodiversity management units, which were directly within the mine's footprint, are the ones where the most significant impact has happened at this site. We also then look at what the pressures are. So actually outside a lot of the mining footprint, the pressures are relatively low. There may be small amounts of disturbance, small amounts of degradation, some incidental injury or killing of species, but in general, the majority of the pressure is being felt within that mining footprint. And then we looked at what the response the company had actually had to those. And the company's implementation of the mitigation measures it had put in place was actually really good. the reason that it doesn't get a very good score and gets a medium one instead is related to the fact that actually the company itself had just updated its own policies and procedures and was aiming now to move towards a net positive impact at the site. And the plans that they'd put in place needed to still be updated to then align with that. So at the moment, the idea was that the response could be better, but we already knew that that process to improve the plan was in place, and so we expected, if they do this in a year's time, it will be better. You can see that we do have for a number of the indicators unknown, where there just wasn't enough data available to make a good assessment. And that's why during this process of piloting, we decided to add in this data confidence score at the end. How confident can we be that this is actually what's happening on the ground? So for some of them, where we have very comprehensive site-level data that's being monitored at a regular basis, we can be very confident and we can have this at level 3. But for some of them, where there's either some gaps or where we have to rely on a level of qualitative expert opinion from consultants or from national experts, then we want to indicate this. We want to say, when we see this dashboard, this is what we think is happening, but this is the areas where you need to think about the uncertainties that still exist, and maybe you want to go out and collect some more data on these particular species or habitats to confirm that what you think is happening is actually reality and it's not just due to the lack of data. So finally, just some lessons learned that we had from this piloting process. First of all, it's that this initial dashboard, in particular for stage 2, is quite time intensive to set up. We were working as an NGO partner, and we also had site level managers involved, and it still took us a couple of weeks to get this dashboard set up. But actually, once the dashboard is set up and you know what the features are, updating it with new yearly monitoring data is really quite simple. You just put the same data into the tool, and it will update the dashboard for you. So you can track it through time. Relatively simple. It's just that upfront cost in resources that's the challenge. As I've just mentioned, the understanding of data quality and consistency is key, and that's why we added that data confidence column to our dashboards. And that actually the on-site capacity to engage in this process is really, really important. We had very good engagement with this site, and it really helped. There were other pilots where maybe the capacity of certain sites wasn't at the same level to engage, and this is when you ran into some of the problems. So this is one of the key things to note. And that finally, the dashboard itself isn't enough to be able to understand what's actually happening at this site. And they need to be supported by these narratives in order to tell a company, okay, this is what is happening at the site at the moment, but this is the way that you can improve, and this is how we can start to turn that dashboard so we see more and more of those indicators turning green. So that's just a quick summary of the Anglo-American pilot. I'm going to hand back to Rodrigo.
And now we are moving to the Total case. We'll hear from Adeline from a biodiversity consultancy, which worked together with us on the Total case.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So yes, we have worked with Total Energies on the application of the BC approach. So there are 2 things that we have done for that. First, it's to develop a customized approach for Total Energy biodiversity footprint impact derived on the step 1 of the stage 1 of the BC approach. And the second thing that we have done is to pilot the second stage, so the state pressure response framework on one pilot site. So regarding the customized approach that we have developed with Total Energy, we have currently tested it on 9 pilot sites, and we will keep improving the approach and adding additional things. So the main difference compared to the BC approach is that we have added one component, which is to have an approach to quantify the footprint at the beginning. So to do that, we are using mostly data that are available at corporate level, and then we have developed a bespoke approach for each operation type. Then for the identification of the biodiversity risk, it's really close to what has been explained before, but we have added some additional component to assess the biodiversity risk. So in the first step, we only use global data layers, And we are using also the critical habitat layer from UNED WCMC, and we use the presence of protected areas. But we are also using global layers to identify some potential rare or important habitats, such as mangrove. We are also using some specific global layers to about habitat sensitivity. So, for example, we have one indicators of ecoregion intactness, one about habitat loss rate, and the range rarity value. In addition to that, we also have one indicator about species. So for that, we piloted STAR, the threat abatement and restoration layers. And then we are planning in the next phase to add some additional indicators that are specific for some species and some operation types. So for example, we plan to develop a birds and bat collision risk score. So then in the step approach, in the second step, what we do is actually what has been explained for step 2, where we look at the number of species doing a high-level IBAT screening. And in step 3, we validate either with site data, some document from the site, or we can also validate with the manager of the site if the findings are appropriate. So regarding the second stage, so our experience from this pilot, so we piloted on one site. The first thing is that for us it gives a very good framework for the company to help them to have this state pressure framework. It helps them to understand if it aligns with their expectation on what they should do, and that will help them in the next phase to monitor their progress. So there are some specificity for this pilot. The first thing is the project we used was still in construction. So we have focused on the pre-project baseline. And then because the project had a critical habitat assessment, we use that to identify the focal biodiversity features. So some of the challenge and the lesson learned is, I think, quite similar to what Leo explained, is you really need to have a very good understanding of the project to be able to develop your indicators. It can be quite time-consuming, and the best way to do that is to have some of the people from the project that are involved during the process. Then, so specifically for this project, because it was still in construction, sometimes it can be tricky to get all the data, but at the same time it's quite interesting because you apply it and it helps you to identify some potential gaps and where you may need to collect some additional information. In this specific case, what we decided to do also is to test what would look like the framework based on the anticipated impact of the project. Finally, as Leo said, yes, it's quite useful to have some additional information, so you need some narrative around it. It's quite useful around the framework to get some additional information that will ensure some consistency through time, and that will also help to better understand the context. So for example, you can add some information about the trend of the species decline or the habitat decline in the site that will help you to understand the potential risk. And it will be very useful to have some information about assumptions that you have used to develop the different score and the different indicators. And specifically, so in this pilot, we use all the critical habitat features to, as a focal biodiversity feature. And it also shows us how important it is to select them carefully, because sometimes it can be quite difficult to collect all the data that are necessary. But one of the approach that we used for that was to use the habitat associated with some of the specific species to be able to identify the potential decline and the potential pressures. That's it from me.
So now we have some time for question and answers. Because both really interesting examples, thank you Leo, thank you Adeline, showing the application of the methodology in different contexts. So Total incorporated the first stage as a corporate measure and adapted the methodology a bit, but that's fine. So the methodology is out there for companies to use. It's not proprietary. What we want is to develop this kind of methodologies and approaches for them to be useful for companies. And if it requires a company to modify it a bit, and that's something we are currently actually exploring with another energy company, that they wanted to add additional layers and criteria to define the right risk area. So we have time for questions. Anyone? Let's take one from the public first. And there are 2 questions here.
Okay. Hi, I was wondering, do you need to do anything? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, super. I was just wondering, in your cases, what was it that motivated the companies to use those indicators in this approach? Was it a legal obligation, or were they just doing it to show and demonstrate that they're actually not harming nature? What brought you in? What was the motivation?
I guess there are two possible motivations there. One is the company wanting to improve their monitoring and tracking of performance at corporate level, so that the corporate personnel of the company is aware of what's happening in the sites. In the other is the focus on reporting and disclosure. So to be able to have a more clear criteria in terms of what to select when disclosing and when reporting publicly data afterwards. So I would say those are the main 2. Leo?
Yeah, I think one of the other interesting things is around just knowing what to monitor and how to monitor it. When we start with these stage 1 screenings and we pull out species lists from the IUCN Red List, you can pull out 1,000 species. Obviously, a company's not going to impact all of those species. It's also not going to be able to monitor all those species. So it's about trying to narrow that down to where we think they are likely to have those impacts and how they can prioritize the budgets and the resources they have to monitor on the right things.
I believe we have one question from the online. Sorry, Laura.
No problem. So congratulations to UNEP WCMC and partners for this ambitious project. How do you see this document influencing initiatives such as the Science-Based Targets for Nature?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because both are developing in parallel. So we have now the Science-Based Targets for Nature in developing, and they are looking at several different methodologies. What we are trying to do, and we actually, UNEP WCMC and Fund of Flora International and others, we are directly involved with the Science-Based Targets for Nature process. So it's basically the same people working on this are linked to the development of science-based. So what we try to do is bring the lessons learned and the experience with methodology into those processes. If it's going to be the same, it's different. This started as a project focused on extractive companies, heavy on data, focus on site-based impacts. So we not necessarily the same outcome will come from the science-based targets from nature. So it's just, it might be something different, might be something additional, might be something that companies that have this kind of impact, which is not all companies will be looking at doing.
Yeah, again, just to add, I think, Rodrigo, you showed at the start there are a lot of different methodologies out there now to measure impact and corporate performance. And we were part of that process when we did this, but we were one of the few that were actually starting at site level. A lot of the others would start the other way around at corporate level and try and understand the impact that way. So we've really tried to feed in the learnings from a site level approach into some of the initiatives, like the Align initiative that was on one of our sessions yesterday at the Business Hub. And yeah, it's through that we filter our learnings through to some of the larger global sort of initiatives to develop indicators and targets.
Yeah, in one sense, it's only when you look on the ground what's available and that you find the challenges. And that's the problem. I guess that's what we try to do here with our bottom-up approach, so that we really face challenges because we're looking at what's actually happening there on the ground.
Hi, my name is Vipul Sharma. I work with IUCN India office and similar kind of projects for Business and Biodiversity program for almost 10 years. My question to both the companies is how they rationalize to decide whatever their list of species they are getting from IBAT without having the primary assessment at the site on what are the species that you are going to impact directly.
I guess that's when the validation with the site managers come.
Yes.
So
What was the process followed for the validation? Because see, when you scan your site with IBAT, it gives us a big list of species or red list species that are found in that area within the buffer that you are putting in. Now, based on that database, it is very difficult to decide without having a primary assessment at the site that what are the species are actually present in this area or what are not. So what was the process followed by both the companies to have this validation that these are the species are present or not?
I think it's a really good point. And actually, to be perfectly honest, in the way that this was done, the sites that we piloted the methodology already had those primary assessments done. Some of these have been operating for 10 years. They had those baseline data and monitoring in place. So we could be a little bit more confident that, if we think a species hasn't been picked up through monitoring, even when it was specifically being targeted over that time period, then we can confidently rule it out. If you were starting this from a site that was even before the baseline, then you'd have to operate on that precautionary approach of keeping them in until you can really guarantee and convince people that you have the data to rule them out.
Maybe just to add also that in the approach that we have developed with Total Energy, that's one of the reasons why we are suggesting to divide in 3 steps. So in the first step, we only use the global layers. And if the result from that is that the site is at very, very low risk, then it does not need to go to the next phase. So the idea is really here to have a tool that can be used at corporate level to be able to understand. We don't specifically need to do that for all of them. And then they will go into the next phase to use the IBAT screening. If they got from the IBAT screening, the result is that there may be some risk, we will go into the document of the project to validate all the results.
So a project that's low risk in the screening phase, it's very likely that it's already a very precautionary approach to the screening process. So if it's low at this high level using the global data, it's very likely that it is low in fact. So, and the ones that are high, the idea is to check on the ground, and usually in this case you have some environmental impact assessment or other kind of assessment already done for the area. We have another question from the online participant.
Yes, so how do you evaluate the commitment of the companies to turn the dashboard greener?
I mean, in the long term, in the case of the pilot, so the idea is that once the dashboard is incorporated by the company, this would be informing monitoring in long term, and by informing monitoring in long term, that's when it would turn green. In this case, what we have is a picture of that moment of the pilot, so that we have not followed those same sites in following years, and that's this will come with time, I believe, once companies really incorporate this methodology and start using those dashboards to inform decision making within the company, is that we might see this process happening. So
I think as well another sort of point to have about the companies that are actually doing this is this isn't something they're being required to do. This is additional to the regulatory requirements they have around monitoring. So there isn't going to be a company that's going to put all this effort and time and resources into developing this dashboard of indicators to do nothing with it. They have already identified that this is something that can be of use to them before they go into this process, and I think that's a key thing that gives you an indication that there is confidence they will try and turn this as green as quickly as possible.
okay, if we have no other questions, I will move to the closing remarks by Mark Johnston. Mark is the chair of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Working Group from IPICA. Mark, if you could just say a little words on how you see this process, and also to explain what IPICA is for those that don't know.
Lovely, thank you very much. First of all, can I say a big thank you to the presenters, everybody, for the presentation, so thank you very much. So everybody, I'm Mark Johnston. I'm the chair of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Working Group in IPICA. Just a little bit about IPICA. So it's basically the Oil and Gas Association for Environmental and Social Issues. We have 39 members, companies within the association. And the association is there really to, two things. One is sort of sharing good practice across industries, large companies and small, sort of raising the standard, if you like, across the industry. And then providing technical guidance to our members for improving environmental performance. And I think this is a really good example of doing that, both in terms of developing guidance and supporting guidance, which is then available to everybody, not just our industry, but also the sharings and learnings which the companies have been through as part of this whole process. So I think that it's not just the product, if you like, it's actually the learnings through that as well. So I know Peak has had a good long relationship with WCMC. We've worked with them on a number of different products. There's a horizon scanning report which we issued recently, which they did for us. It helps inform our strategy and what our priorities are. We also do something called peer-to-peer training with WCMC, which is it's like a 2-day intense training on biodiversity for our companies, for the companies in our PICA. So they provide a lot of the technical expertise into that materials, and it's actually taught by professionals in companies, like myself or others within companies, to other our peers. So we've had several of these workshops in different countries of sharing expertise across the industry, and a lot of the work has been provided by WCMC. So I won't keep you much longer, because I'm conscious at the end of the day, probably all dying for a drink. So in terms, very quickly, just in terms of the framework, one thing I really like about this framework is, one, its flexibility, and I like the idea that actually some of the companies have taken it and adopted it and changed it slightly to their own particular needs. So that's one thing I think is great. I also like the idea of this dashboard, because companies can use it to see, look at their whole portfolio, look at all the different sites or projects, see where they are relatively quickly, and it can easily pull out, well, okay, which of our sites are the most important or most critical for biodiversity? So we can put those as the priority. Not saying the others aren't important as well, but we can easily, just as a prioritization process. And I think one of the question was online about how do we make all those go green? Well, that can take quite a bit of work, I suspect. But at least what you can do, it does again flag to the company that if it's red, we need to be doing something about it. And the target for the company may be then, yes, we need to make it, the target or objective is to make it green. We can try, we might not be able to, because there's all sorts of different issues, but it helps to do that. And then finally, I think also in terms of performance, in terms of how companies can use this for performance purposes, just to understand, and hopefully I think the next step would be really interesting to see how can we use the tool to monitor sort of the corporate performance side of things. It'd be really quite interesting to understand how that can be used. So I shall leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. Hope you found it interesting, and happy to chat afterwards with anybody who wants to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the session. There is a social here in 15 minutes, so if you guys are interested.